of Florida, Adele Graham. Well, Bob, it's been 7 months since our last conversation, and what a turbulent 7 months it's been. Are we on the brink of a devastating war, or just as devastating, perhaps to a significant portion of our population, a strike by the National Football League? Certainly we are a more divided nation than we were then, with a full-blown culture war tearing our country apart. A well-respected journalist recently wrote, "America's seen more cultural conflict than it did since the late 1960s. It's quite possible that after 4 years of this, Trump will have effectively destroyed the prevailing culture. The reign of the meritocratic establishment will be just as over as the reign of Protestant establishment is now." Even more disturbing is an essay in an August issue of the New Yorker by Robin Wright entitled, "Is America Headed for a New Kind of Civil War?" One of the many things people have admired in you is your optimistic but always realistic and common sense posture. So tell us how you see the nation today, the direction in which it's going.
Okay, am I on? Good. Good for me, bad for you. Walter, thank you very much for inviting us back. I like the way that you commanded this person to seat himself and let you go about your business. Once a Methodist minister, always a Methodist. That's what I say. That article that Walter just referred to by Robin Wright, very fine journalist, contained within it the results of a survey that she took. She contacted a number of prominent academics, people in history, sociology, political science, and asked them the question. The question itself is ominous enough. What do you think are the chances, the probabilities, that the United States of America will be in a civil war in the next 15 years? Well, now all of us are going to be around to see what the prophecy comes to be. But of that group that she surveyed, the most aggressive person thought that the Civil War would occur with a 95% probability. The most conservative thought that it would occur, but only with a 5% probability. The average of all respondents was 35%. The fact that 1 out of 3 thoughtful academic persons concluded that it was a 35% chance that the United States would be in a civil war. This is not Lee versus Graham, it's kind of civil war. But suppose there were 1,000 Charlottesville on the same weekend. That's the kind of civil war that Ms. Wright is talking about. I'm glad I wasn't in that survey. I would have been towards the lower end of the spectrum. It's inconceivable to me that our country, which has been in existence now for closing in on 250 years, would during our generation, decline into civil war. But I think, as Walter said, the events of the recent past are not sources of comfort. It appears as if, to use the old Yeats poem, that the center isn't holding, and the power has gone to the extremes of the left and the right. The challenge is going to be how do we bring those back together. Earlier today, I talked to a group of students at the university about another op-ed that appeared in the New York Times. This one with the question, after Charlottesville, colleges vow to do something, but what? And I asked the group of about 25 students what they thought the University of Florida ought to do in order to reverse this increasing divisiveness. And I know a lot of folks here at Oak Hammock have had affiliation either as students or as members of the faculty at the University of Florida, and so you care for that institution. And Oak Hammock carries the name of the University of Florida. Some of the things that they suggested were that we should have small groups which are diverse in their representation, i.e. they cover gender, race, age, to talk about why they feel the way they do about the United States in 2017, so that there can be an open, peaceful discussion and better understanding of the range of opinion. That might not be a bad idea, not only on the University of Florida campus among students. It might be, Walter, a good idea right here at Oak Hammock to have an opportunity for better understanding of why people see the world and see the nation differently than they do. Another was to use social media as a means of getting people to express their thoughts and opinions and then to respond to those thoughts and opinions. The provost at the University of Florida is going to hold a conference next spring on this subject of social division, which will be primarily directed at the faculty of the University of Florida. And I suggested that it should be open to faculties of colleges and universities across the state, because this is not just a University of Florida issue. In fact, it might be even a lesser issue here than it is in some of the more urban colleges and universities in Florida. So those are a few of the thoughts that came out of a discussion with some students and faculty. I hope that as we get into the Q&A period, that if some of you have some thoughts as to what are tangible things that can be done in order to learn the lesson of Charlottesville. And then I think what the lesson of Las Vegas was, that how close we are to open violence, that one person could kill 59 people and injure 500 is a testimony to the degree to which persons who are willing to engage in that can render serious harm to many innocent souls. So Charlottesville plus Las Vegas is not a future that we want to have for ourselves and those that are dear to us.
One of the things that Robin Wright emphasized, of course, was the rise of the alt-right, the white supremacists, the anti-Semitists, the racists. Those values are not the values that have held our nation together over the years. Do you really see that kind of a disrespect for the values that we like to think are the American values, the cement that holds us together?
Well, the fact is, we've had periods similar to this in the past. For instance, in the period immediately after the Civil War, after the slaves were granted their freedom, then quickly what were referred to as Jim Crow laws came into effect, which effectively took away many of those rights, particularly or most notably, such as rights to vote. Then again, around World War I, there was what they called the Red Scare, where we became very concerned about communism, which had just taken over Russia, becoming a force in the United States. Many people were attacked for being communist when they were not, and that was an unhappy period. And here in Florida, I imagine that you folks, like I, can remember the Johns Committee, which was set up in the early 50s because of the feeling that there were homosexuals and communists on the faculties of Florida universities. In places like the University of Florida, I was still in high school at that time, but I came here in 1955, and the reverberations were still being felt. It had a chilling effect on our freedom of academic expression. So what we're going through now has its own special features, but it's not out of keeping with other periods in American history when we have felt a sense of distrust of the other, whether the other was a religious other, a racial other, a thoughtful other. And maybe we need to, as part of our current challenge of dealing with the shockwaves of Charlottesville, go back and study how did previous generations of Americans deal with similar issues, and are there any lessons that we could learn and apply to what we're facing today.
And of course, then there were the 60s, and Ken Burns' masterful documentary on the Vietnam War certainly reminded us of the intensity of feeling that was across the country, a very divisive situation. I thought our mutual friend David Coburn's op-ed piece in last Sunday's Gainesville Sun was very interesting. He was in Vietnam as a member of the armed forces. He took one point of view. When he came back to do his PhD at Capitol Hill, all of a sudden he realized there was a whole different point of view, and he was converted to that point of view. Well, you often have stumped me with trivia questions, such as, what are a group of frogs called? And if any of you in the audience knows the answer to that question, you're a lot better informed than I am. Well, one trivia question you asked me the other day was, what country was the first to recognize the United States after the Declaration of Independence? And I found your insights as to the significance of that act today in terms of our country's influence in encouraging a peaceful solution to the conflicts of the Middle East quite persuasive. I'm sure our audience would find those insights very interesting, as well as I.
Well, you're not going to get off the hook. Does anyone here know the first country to recognize the sovereignty of the United States?
Hand over there.
Morocco. Yeah. Give that man a very big award. Well, the reason I know that fact is Adele and I guess it's been 10 years and more now, took a trip to Morocco, and in the course of that we had lunch at the residence of the U.S. ambassador, and he very proudly showed us a photocopy of a letter written by George Washington in his own hand, and it was a letter to the then Emir of Morocco. The Emir had written Washington saying that the Moroccan ships and sailors were being preyed upon by the British, and they were taking sailors into captivity. They were sinking their boats, a lot of bad things. And since the Moroccans had been the first country to recognize and lend at least their moral support to our campaign for independence, maybe we would help them deal with this British preying upon their naval people and ships. Well, Washington wrote the emir back and was very effusive in his thanks for Morocco having recognized the United States. But he said, we're a small country. We had only a population of about 4 million at this time. We're a long way away, and we are still recovering from the ravages of war. And as much as we would like to be helpful to our friends, we're just not in a position to do so now. To me, the most moving part of his letter was the last paragraph in which he said, Your Honor, while we are not able to respond to your request at this time, I hope there may be a time in the future when the United States is able to recognize and come to the aid of its friends and allies. So that set the American value on dealing with other nations, that where we could be a source of support and assistance to our allies, friends, that we would attempt to do so. I think about that now because it seems as if we're withdrawing from our friends and allies. We have withdrawn from a number of important multinational treaties, particularly the Paris Accord on Clean Air, and we have significantly cut back our various forms of diplomatic and other support for other countries. I don't think it is the American tradition to be an isolationist, exclusive country. At least it hasn't been for most of our lifetime. And that this is a time when particularly some of the most critical issues that we face cannot be solved by the United States alone. As much as we would like to, we cannot solve issues like international terrorism without other nations being also part of that effort. We cannot solve issues like Ebola and other rapidly spreading diseases without assistance from other nations. Without other assistance from other nations, we cannot have our level of economic prosperity, which has become increasingly dependent upon the cross flow of goods and services. So this is a time not for us to be retreating into a cave, but rather stepping further out into the sunlight of being a part of the world in which, yes, we're proud to be Americans, but part of that pride is our ability to be an important part of the larger community that populates this planet.
Well, while we're still on foreign policy and
excuse me. One of our not handheld mics is on the fritz right now, and I'm used to wearing that. Let's deal with our foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. In your years in the Senate, and ever since, you have been one of the best informed statesmen on that troubled era, and especially on the often puzzling relationship the United States has had with Saudi Arabia. What do you make of the new and, to many of us, alarming alignment of the United States exclusively with the Sunni nations, as announced by President Trump in his recent visit to Saudi Arabia, especially with regard to our ability to be an effective broker for peace in that fractured area?
Going back to the last question, I think one of the great contributions that the United States has made is being seen as an honest broker, and with that mantle have been able to be an effective force in bringing people who had been at war with each other or on the verge of war together. And I'm concerned that in a number of areas, by essentially being seen to have picked sides, we have lost much of our ability to resolve those differences. I don't, frankly, have an adequate understanding of why the Sunnis and the Shiites are as antagonistic and violent towards each other. I guess until I study some of the history of Christianity and see what over the centuries different sects of Christianity have done to each other. But I think that it's important for the United States to recognize that it needs to protect that banner of honest broker. And I think we could be an effective force in the current schism that has inflamed the Middle East between the Shiites and the Sunnis. I think we need to be an honest broker if we're going to resolve the issue between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I'm concerned that we've gotten so far on one side on that issue that we have really damaged the value of our friendship with that one side, i.e. Israel, by our inability to be as effective a force in solving what is their greatest national challenge, which is to bring peace to that corner of the world.
We've had some interesting conversations recently, and I picked up that ever since you and Adele saw the Broadway musical Hamilton, you have been an avid researcher on the life and the writings of that often neglected founding father, Alexander Hamilton. In the conversation we had not long ago, you mentioned some of the insights of his that could be instructive to our nation's foreign policy today. What are they?
Well, I would say the one I just talked about. He was a great believer that the United States, even in its infancy, had a moral quotient that made it a valuable world participant in trying to resolve difficult problems. Hamilton was also a strong believer in the importance of international commerce, that people who had a stake in other countries doing well economically, and they had a stake in us doing well economically, were less likely to become adversaries. And so he strongly supported U.S. ability to be a participant in the limited international commerce that existed in the 18th century. He also was a very strong opponent of slavery. I met some folks as I was walking in who used to live in St. Croix, a beautiful, now distressed island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, distressed because it took a direct shot from Hurricane Irma and then skirted by Hurricane Marie. But Alexander Hamilton was born in Nevis. Dell and I recently were there and saw his birthplace, and then moved as a young man to St. Croix, where he developed his skills, which led him later to be probably the first great economist of the United States. And he was an avid opponent of slavery, because in both his home island, Nevis, and St. Croix, they had a large number of slaves, particularly working in sugar cane plantations, and he saw how mistreated they were and how it put the whole community in a constant state of apprehension that the slaves were going to rise up and they would have a bloody revolution. And so had he lived, and of course his life was cut short by a tragic duel, I think he would have been a force for earlier efforts to abolish slavery in the those which finally came with Abraham Lincoln in 1863.
Well, you know, I look out at this audience and I realize that all of us go way back. For many years of Florida's history, but many of this audience were not in Florida in the years when we had governors like Leroy Collins and Reuben Askew and you and Lawton Child, who so emphasized quality public education, who cared deeply about the environment, but also were strong on the development of Florida and in Florida's economics. We had a League of Women Voters meeting here last night with Sue Lake talking about PAC, which is Parents Against Corporate Takeover of Public Schools. And she said very, very strongly and frankly, there's a war going on against public education. Do you have any encouraging words to us to say about where we're going with public education, not just in this state, but in the nation?
Yes, I think that our public schools have developed within themselves the ability to offer a wide range of choice. I personally believe in the basic idea of people having alternatives, including in education. And I think our public schools are responding to that by providing variety. In the county, Dade, there are now public schools that offer specialized programs in everything from oceanography to astronomy and everything in between. What in charter schools, which have become the most visible challenge to public schools, I think can have a place, but I think with some conditions. One, they've got to be held accountable in the same way that public schools are held accountable. There was an article in the press today, in fact, about a study that had been done indicating that charter school students don't graduate at the same rate that the public school students do once they are admitted to college, which is a imprecise but somewhat of an indicator of the quality of education they're providing. I think they should be held to the same standard. In other areas, for instance, the legislature has just voted that a significant share of your property tax that has gone to the public schools for purposes of school maintenance, restoration, and new construction is now going to be shared with charter schools. But while public schools have very strict building code standards, and in many counties they were the principal shelters for people during the recent hurricanes because they are built to such high standards, those don't apply to charter schools. We were in Panama City recently, and the superintendent was pointing out that a charter school there had just completed a new building built out of wood. That's been banned for public schools for at least 40 or 50 years because of the fire safety issues of wooden buildings and also their structural exposure to things like Hurricane Irma. So I think the public schools are improving. I'd like to see the pace of that improvement accelerate. I have an idea of someone who might be elected governor who I think would do that. As my wife and I are So we believe in that, not only as an educational system, but also, I went to Hialeah Elementary School. Hialeah Elementary School was built, the physical building, as a Seminole Indian school. And then when the tribe diminished in numbers, it was opened up to the full population. And it was the greatest experience in democracy of my life to go to a school that had such a wide range of student backgrounds. And I think that is an enormously valuable part of being an American, is to have that early exposure to as many different fellow Americans who share a different set of personal experiences. Public schools provide that.
Well, now, let's talk about some of these recent natural disasters. They have focused attention on the issue of climate change, with public opinion and scientific evidence moving in one direction, and the present administration seemingly moving in the opposite direction. Now, you said that this issue needs political action as well as scientific evidence. Is constructive political action possible today?
Yeah, and I think it's more possible today than it was 90 days ago. I mean, the impact of these three hurricanes, Harvey, Wilma, Marie, and now a fourth one, Nate, hanging around in the Gulf of Mexico, have driven home to people that something different is happening. They may not be able to tell you in scientific terms what's happening, but you don't have to be a scientist to feel that something is making climate change. And these have been dramatic examples of that difference. So I believe that public opinion, which already was moving towards from general support of policies on climate change, are now moving to strong support. I think there's also that the climate change debate is going to be of two parts. One is what should we do to deal with the degree to which climate change is already baked into the cake, such as being sure that we have an infrastructure that can stand up to an increasing number of more violent hurricanes, such as having adequate roads to provide evacuation for. There were 6 million people evacuated South Florida during Hurricane Irma. That's a lot of folks and a lot of automobiles, and we found that our highways were barely capable of handling that mass migration. Those kind of issues. But then the second tier of issues are what can we do to try to arrest it getting worse. And those get to the most politically contentious because they're going to require some changes in the way most of us are used to acting on a day-to-day basis. We drive a gasoline automobile, a big source of contribution to global warming. We are reticent to adopt sustainable forms of electrical generation, like solar panels. Another, the burning of fuels for electric production are another big source of global warming. I think the battleground is won on step one. People are prepared now to take the steps that will deal with the known consequences of the global warming that we've already experienced, and the percentage of the population that's ready to support the steps that will avoid it getting worse is larger today than it's ever been.
The problem is sometimes when the people are ready, the politicians are not. And we certainly see that with regard to gun control. The people in this country are ready for Congress to enact meaningful gun control, but I don't know, I've heard many wise people who seem to know what's going on say that they don't see much chance of that happening. Well, I have one more question. You've already given us one. Yes.
Well, I agree with that up to a point. What has happened in the past is that in the area of gun control, it takes a violent act to get people to move. When I was in the Senate, there had just been some instances of uses of semi-automatic weapons to kill lots of people. And we passed, beginning in 1994, a prohibition on this manufacture or sale of semi-automatic weapons in the United States. That's the good news. The bad news is that it had a 10-year life, and when it came up for renewal in 2004, it was defeated. So we don't have it anymore, and thus this madman takes what he ended up with 12 semi-automatic weapons, which he had converted to be fully automatic, and butchers 59 people and then 500 other casualties. I think that's going to cause a revisiting of this issue of automatic and semi-automatic weapons. The difficulty is, if you believe that there should be common sense gun control, there's not a general consensus for what that means and what the consequences will be. As an example, there's been an issue in the legislature which has largely been frustrated by one person, a state senator named Senator Flores, who was chairman of, she was chairman of a committee that had jurisdiction over gun-related legislation. She would not allow the bill that would provide for open college campuses, that is, that you could carry a firearm open, I guess like Tom Mix used to do on his belt, on a university campus. I think now that she has got only one more session, that beginning in 2018, there will be a very major push to allow open carry guns on university campuses. Again, without being political, there is a candidate for governor who is committed to vetoing that bill should it pass, and I certainly hope that won't be necessary, but it will give us reassurance to know she's sitting there prepared to do so if called upon.
And you know, you've already given a partial answer to what my last question was. How is her campaign going? I think we all welcome a progress report.
Well, I'm glad that you turned to someone who's so unbiased.
I can always depend on that, Bob.
At this stage of the campaign, which is the primaries will be in August of 18, and of course the general election in November, there aren't a lot of hard facts to answer your question. One of the hard facts has to do with how many people are willing to invest in your campaign. And the candidate that I'm speaking for, but it would be inappropriate to mention Gwen's name, has been significantly outraising the other Democratic candidates and is now approaching even the leading Republican candidate in terms of monthly fundraising. And then on the other little bit less specific polling, she's been running well ahead of all the other announced Democratic candidates. Now, there are a couple of folks who are circling around and may or may not decide to come to the dance, and they could make it a more competitive Was that a fair and honest answer?
We had a little less time for questions today at Senator Graham's request because he wanted more time for your questions. So we are now ready to entertain questions. Forrest Crawford has a microphone on this side. Manny Rudolph has his hand up. And Dan Heyman has the microphone on this side. So we'll start with Manny's question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, Manny, how are you?
Hi, Senator Graham. Your appearances here add great luster to this excellent institution. Thank you for coming. I spent most of my working and academic life in the fields of media and journalism. I could not believe that there would be a candidate for public office and win that office who would say the following: the press is the enemy of the American people. That was hard to swallow. That notion, that idea would be in the mind of the man who is in charge of the United States of America. Can you comment on that, please?
Well, it is, I mean, quite to the contrary, it has been the press that has been the salvation of democracy at a number of its critical phases. Just to mention one which we're all aware, Watergate would not have been Watergate and certainly would not have led to the resignation of the President of the United States, but for the aggressive, effective, and highly professional press, which brought to the public's attention what was and had happened, and that led to such a public outcry that the President had to resign. So I think that the basic proposition that the press is the enemy of the American people is absurd. I think this particular person who's making that statement, whose name escapes me, the press has pointed out during the campaign and now in office where he has misstated the truth and has corrected it. He doesn't like people to challenge the authority of his word. Also, the press has been reporting on things like the Russia connection, which he particularly is uneasy about. So he would be well served if the press were shut down, but so would Richard Nixon.
Trivia questions. If President Washington was unable to... Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
Sitting down. If President Washington refused invitation to intervene in the Mediterranean, what president enthusiastically welcomed the invitation and committed our armed forces to the Mediterranean? The first one.
You mean to the eastern or western Mediterranean? Western. Which president? Well, I guess it was the theme, the Marine Corps anthem has from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. So somebody committed our troops to Tripoli early in our government. I would say it was probably either President Adams or Jefferson, but I'm not sure.
Jefferson. I recommend you the book Jefferson's War.
What's that?
Jefferson's War is a great book on the subject.
When I was growing up, well, maybe I shouldn't say that because people say that hasn't happened yet. When I was in school, the books said that the founding fathers said our democracy was based on for the people, by the people, for the people, and of the people, by the people, for the people. And we all believed it. I think we all believed it, and I think we would all like to believe it now. But I think somewhere along the line, we believed it so much that we didn't keep our eye on what was going on. And gerrymandering and all sorts of things took place. So the government now, which according to what we learned is of the people, by the people, for the people, young people coming along look at it and say, well, if that's that form of government, let's tear it down and get rid of it and do something else that really will help the people. Then comes along the group of people that say, but we have a solution after we tear it down. You read the books wrong. It's of the business, by the business, for the business. We will take care of everything. How do we try to get back of the people, by the people, for the people? Since it's the ballot box, and that's what we lost our way on.
Well, I would give two beginning answers to your question. One, more people need to exercise their privilege of voting. I believe in the last presidential election, only about half of the Americans who could have voted took the opportunity to do so. If half your population is saying it's unimportant to me, then I guess they have to be prepared to live with the consequences of that. And the second is something that Walter alluded to earlier, and that is the enormous amount of money and the uses of that money to pervert public policy. Why has there been so much resistance to renewable energy? Well, I think it may have something to do with the fact that there are a lot of folks in this country, very well-to-do, who have a big stake in continuing to burn gasoline. And they don't want any encouragement to change that system. So the use of money in politics has become a significant perversion of the public interest. I have had an idea that in Florida we're now at the 20-year mark where a Constitutional Revision Commission is going to produce amendments that will be submitted directly to the people. Looking at the way in which the government has dealt with the constitutional amendments that the people have put into the Constitution, such as most recently things like fair districts, which took years of litigation to get implemented. Today, the Florida Forever Amendment that would preserve more of Florida places like Payne's Prairie have been largely dismissed by the office holders, that we ought to have an amendment to the Constitution to strike the words that begin the Constitution for the people and just have a public debate. Are we really going to be a government for the people and act that way? That suggestion is frivolous and no one has taken it up. But I think the dismissiveness of the will of the people by public officials is more than just a frivolous problem.
Senator, one of the scariest things that I've learned, at least I'm an MSNBC junkie, I'll confess that. But anyway, the revelation begrudgingly by Facebook and Twitter and other blog sources, and I think they call it electronic or digital platforms that were used in the recent election to put out fake news, counter news, Russian news, etc. Do you see any way we can control that over the short term? And is that an issue for the Election Commission? Or is there a governmental entity that can deal with that? And what is the likelihood of any of those happening?
Well, is that in your sentence the fact that they carried these advertisements that originated in Russia Well, I think that just like the over-the-air television and radio stations are regulated not as to the content, but as to the truth of the content that they can spew out. I don't think it is overreaching to say that the modern form of over-the-air communication, which is over the internet, should have some standards of truthfulness, including a statement as to who sponsor or the payor for that particular advertisement, so that when the people see it, they can take that into account as to how much credibility they'll give to the message that's being delivered.
I'm working on the Second Chance Voting Restoration Amendment, getting petitions so that people automatically get their rights back when they serve their sentences. Would you have some comment on that?
I do. I support the amendment, but I'm going to tell you with a reservation. My reservation is this: we do not need a constitutional amendment to restore the rights of convicted felons. In fact, from the time of Leroy Collins through the time of Lawton Childs, Democratic and Republican governors had a system in which if a person had served their time and had been under supervision, that had been completed satisfactorily, and they had no bad marks since release, they got their rights restored almost automatically. And this is not just a political right to vote. It also is, in many cases, an economic right to work. For instance, in this state, you can't, if you've had a felony conviction that has not been removed by restoration of your rights, you can't be a barber. You can't work in a beauty salon. Just two of scores of occupations in Florida that are not available to you without having your rights restored. So it's a serious economic issue for those affected. The reason I say the amendment is not necessary is that given the right governor, who will go back to the tradition that we had for a half a century in this state, that policy can be implemented on day one of their administration. And I know of at least one candidate who's committed to doing so, should it be necessary.
But Governor Scott has only given it back for 2,500 people.
I'm surprised it's that
In
high.
his whole term.
Where is the next question?
I'd like to address an issue, please, that you first raised, Walter. I'm concerned about North Korea. Our government is being run by some incoherent tweets. What do you see ahead for us in our relationships with North Korea? Are you as concerned as many of us are?
Well, I'm very concerned because we seem to be on a pattern first of general disparagement, and then each side trying to figure out what's the most obnoxious term that we can apply to the leader of the other, and the dismissal of trying to reach a diplomatic solution. I think that there either is going to be no solution or it's going to be diplomatic, because if it's the cost of a military solution, which will be in the millions of lives because of the proximity of South Korea to North Korea, and the closeness even of Japan. This is a situation that will rapidly disintegrate into human slaughter of almost an unprecedented scale. So I think that we've got to get back to the diplomatic table. There was an interesting discussion over the weekend, I think on this Fareed Zakaria show, which is my favorite 1 hour of television every week, and I highly recommend it. and they had a person talking about the fact that this needs to be dealt with in a broader context, not just North Korea, but let's look at all the countries in the world that are rapidly building up their nuclear capability. The one that worries me the most, frankly, is not North Korea, but it's Pakistan. Pakistan, in the early part of the century, had less than a dozen nuclear weapons. Today, it's about 120. That means it has enough to do what in the Cold War they used to say, attack and destroy. They have enough to attack, be attacked, and then to attack back. And that's going to be the ultimate worrisome nation. So I think that we've got to figure out some diplomatic solution to put restraints on North Korea. Probably, although this now is also in question under similar terms as the Iranian nuclear agreement, which are things like destroy your capability to make additional nuclear weapons, put the weapons that you already have under international supervision, put them in a condition that they can't be used on short notice, and a whole series of things that don't eliminate the nuclear capability, but substantially cripple it. The fact is, we're almost victims of our own history. What if you were the little rocket man of North Korea, and you looked at what happened to Gaddafi in Libya, for instance, who had a nuclear program which, under pressure, he gave up and then was invaded. The former head of Iraq had a nuclear program which he backed away from, and then he was invaded. I think you could reasonably conclude that the way my best insurance policy against my country being invaded is to have a credible nuclear program. So we've somewhat created the factually based environment that would make having nuclear weapons a rational thing to do.
Yes, along that line, I just received notification that number 45 has saying he's going to decertify the Iran agreement and throw it back in the lap of Congress. That just
well, and again, adding that fact, suppose you were the little rocket man in North Korea and you're approached about entering into a negotiated settlement. And you could say, well, look, Iran entered into a negotiated settlement, and within a few months of the ink being dry, the U.S. tore it up. How can I believe that any settlement I might reach would not have the same fate? So I think we're acting in a way which is putting us into a narrower and narrower corner.
And that was not my question, though. My question was...
Excuse my...
Oh, no, I am happy that you did that. Just, my question, though, was on the Congress. Now, a lot of this, including Iran and a lot of things going on in the country, really are in the lap of the moral midgets up there. And people are angry, you know, on both sides. And that anger, I don't see being abated anytime soon. What do you see? I mean, I don't see any movement by the Republican Congress and even the Democrats at this point in trying, instead of fighting with each other, trying to figure out, okay, what do we really need to do to bring America back together again? They seem to be happy to keep it torn apart. And now we see, like in Alabama, that people are willing to elect even bigger nuts than are already up there in some cases. So, but I mean, this goes both ways. I don't think we can be about who's against this or that. Well, the question is, do you see any of this being addressed rather than being for or against Trump? Do you ever see us getting to the point where, okay, what can we do to end this schism? And what is making people angry, and what can we do to resolve it?
Well, if the we in that sentence is the American people, I think that it starts with groups like are in this room today. What can we as a group do? We can call our congressman. We can write a letter to the president. We can try to join forces with like-minded people to have a larger microphone for our voice. I wish I had an easy answer to the president that we currently have. You can't go to the history books and find a precedent for what is going on now. I hope we can limp through the next 3 years and 4 months and use the interval to select some new leadership.
Is there anybody on my side for a question? Anybody else? Question?
Yes, the idea of having small groups discuss issues across America is wonderful. The only thing that's lacking today is civil discourse, and also a knowledge of our country. Where have we been? Where are we going? Classes in history and civics should be resurrected in the schools. So, I wonder to hear your comment.
Well, you have come to my sweet spot with that statement about teaching history and civics. The history of this was that throughout most of our national existence, teaching about the essential skills and knowledge required to be a good citizen was a high priority. A friend of mine named Bob Putnam is a professor at the Kennedy School. I got to know him there, and he has a chart which demonstrates that from the beginning of public education, which was early in the 19th century, until about 1970, that civics and history were among the highest level in terms of amount of time and quality of time taught in the public school. Beginning in the 1970s, civics and history came to be controversial issues. The far left thought that they were being used to militarize American young people, to particularly make them agreeable towards continuation of the Vietnam War. The far left thought that far right thought that it was being used to train young people or encourage them to go into the streets and participate in civil disobedience. There was one thing that the far left and far right could agree on, and that was that civics and history were bad things. And so it started to disappear from the curriculum. And then a few years later, we had the advent of comprehensive testing, and none of those subjects, as well as the other parts of the social science curriculum, such as economics and geography, were tested in those comprehensive tests. And if it ain't tested, it ain't taught. And so it rapidly, virtually, was gone. In fact, in Florida, there were only a very few school districts that taught civics 10 years ago. Now, the good news is that since that time, something called the Sandra Day O'Connor Act was passed by the legislature, and we are now returning to teaching civics in Florida. And in fact, I was at a conference recently in Washington where Florida and Illinois were recognized as the two states that were in the forefront of returning civics to the curriculum. So I'm proud of that, and I'm immodestly proud of the role that the Graham Center here played in getting civics restored to the curriculum in Florida. So there's a dim ray of hope on the horizon, and it's rising from Florida and Illinois. May the other 48 states follow us.
I'd like to break in and just make a comment that it's encouraging to talk about ways we can encourage the public to make their will known. And goodness knows healthcare was protected by citizen action. But we deal with this almost immovable blockade called gerrymandering. And the Democrats as well as the Republicans have been guilty of it. A very important cases before the Supreme Court now. Do you have any hope that maybe there will be a ruling that will begin to tame that beast?
Yeah. I hope so. And my hope is based on an example a fairly long time ago. The state of Tennessee, when it reapportioned its congressional districts after the 1960 census, did what they had done 6 times decadally previous, and that is they did nothing. They kept the same congressional lines that they'd had, although the population of Tennessee had redistributed itself quite significantly, particularly people moving from rural areas into more urbanized areas. And so some people in Tennessee who were concerned about this brought a case in the federal court. The federal courts had ruled that cases like that were not for the judiciary, but they were for the political system to work out. And that is exactly the issue that's going to be here. And the case went through the federal courts, being thrown out at each level until it got to the Supreme Court. And it was about to be thrown out there. And then something happened. There was a social event in Washington. And at that social event was the man we've mentioned a couple of times, Leroy Collins, who was the first chairman of the Federal Human Rights Commission, and a member of the U.S. Supreme Court, Hugo Black. Black was a man from Alabama, had a lot of traits. One of the previous speakers alluded to the man from Alabama who looks like he's going to be the next senator from Alabama. In a very disparaging way, I might say. Both of my grandparents were born in Alabama. So pride in that state. But anyway, Black talked to Collins about this, and Collins said, for my 6 years as governor, every year I tried to get the legislature to reapportion itself. And Florida was the most malapportioned state of the country. That is, the smallest percentage of voters, less than 25% in Florida, could elect a majority of both houses to the legislature of any state in the nation. And Collins explained his all of the efforts and how frustrated he was at the fact that they all were failures. And Black said they're not going to be failures. He went back to the court, which where all 9 justices make a decision as to whether they will hear cases, take them up in the first instance. And you have to get, I think it's 5 out of the 9 votes to even consider a case. And it was questionable whether they had the 5 votes on this Tennessee case. Hugo Black told his fellow members of the Supreme Court the story that he'd heard from Leroy Collins, and said the fact that a governor is as effective as Leroy Collins tried 6 times to get his legislature to reapportion itself and failed shows that if we decide to leave it to politics, we're going to leave to America a permanently imperfect democracy. And so the court, he got the 5 votes, they took the case up on a 7-2 decision. The court reversed its previous precedent and required Tennessee to reapportion based on the principle of each citizen should have the same weight in terms of reapportionment. That swept across the nation, and Florida was the most transformed state since it was started from the most retarded position. But I tell that story that I hope somebody like Leroy Collins is talking in the ears of the current Supreme Court, explaining to them that if they don't take this issue of gerrymandering up as a judicial matter, if they continue to say it's political, then we're going to again continue to have an imperfect democracy into the unlimited future.
Just one comment. The person who's leading the case is Trevor Potter, Stephen Colbert's PAC lawyer. He's representing the state of Wisconsin in the issue in front of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is discussing it right now.
Oh yes, it's in fact this very week.
Yes, this week it's discussing it.
Yeah.
Keith, you have a question?
Senator, this is something I have crossed my mind many times. You mentioned, and Walter mentioned, that we should be thinking about contacting our senators and our representatives and so forth to make sure that they hear our voices. And I have done all of those things. I have called, I've written letters, I've added extra comments on petitions and so forth and so on. But I just can't get over the feeling of being skeptical about whether those really have any impact. As a senator, as a governor, as a politician for some time, can you give us some sense of what real impact those have?
Well, as Walter was using the example of the recent efforts to repeal and replace Obamacare, it would have been repealed and replaced with something, but for the fact that there was such an enormous outpouring of opposition. Advice, one is the best way to communicate is by telephone. And you can call the number of the United States Congress, and while we're talking, I will get the number off my machine, and ask for whoever you want to talk to, like Congressman Yoho, and tell them. Now, you're probably not going to talk to Congressman Yoho, but somebody in the staff is there taking down. We had 114 calls before noon today in opposition to repealing and replacing Obamacare. Those things make an impact on members of Congress when voices are heard, noted, and added to others and then become a wave. The second thing I would recommend is that a group like this ought to invite Representative Yoho.
He was here.
Oh, he was here, okay.
Weeks ago.
Well, you've already done it, okay. Now, I don't know whether you were happy, sad, impressed, exuberant after that, but at least he knew that there were several hundred serious citizens who were watching what he was doing here at Oak Hammock. And that kind of personal experience will start to have an impact on how they view issues.
All right, now, I think we'll have one last question. But before that question, let me say that Graham has written a very informative book on how citizens really can the kind of things they can do to make a difference. America, the Owner's Manual, and he will be here if I can get some help to move this table down on the floor. He'll bring the books here, and he'll be glad to autograph books if you want to purchase one of them. So, one last question now before we conclude this very worthwhile session with Senator Graham.
The investigation into the terror attack of 9/11.
I can't. Oh, good, I'm sorry.
The investigation into the attack of September 11, 2001. Is that book closed, or is there another chapter to be written?
There's another chapter to be written. Hold your breath, because it's going to be very exciting. But first, I'm going to give you that number in Congress to call. This is the general switchboard, and they will ask you to who you want to speak, and you tell them, and they'll connect you to that office. Okay, here we go. Where are we? I know it's here somewhere. Well, I'm sorry, friends, it's on here. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give the information to Walter. Walter will be responsible for making it. Oh, no, Walter, you're saved. The number is, sir, you want to write this down? 202-234-3121. That's 202. Now I'm going to put on my glasses. 202, I misspoke before. It's 224-3121. 202-224-3121. That's the congressional switchboard where you can reach your member of either the Congress or the Senate. Okay.
Well, these sessions with Senator Graham are always very fascinating, interesting, and informative. Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to answer this gentleman. Walter, are you trying to avoid answering this gentleman? No, I don't think the last chapter has been written. I think there's chapter 1 is likely to be the report by Mr. Mueller when he finishes his investigation. My sense is that he probably is, let's say, he may not be in the red zone yet, but he's on the other side of the field, maybe at the 35-yard line in terms of completing his final report. And he, of all the groups that are looking at this, is the only one that has prosecutorial power. He can actually indict people for a crime and then be the lead prosecutor at a trial. I think second, there will be the congressional reports, which will be primarily focused on the non-criminal issues, but some of the questions that were asked earlier, such as the use of Facebook.
I was asking about the terror attack of September 11th, and you were on a commission involved. Is the last chapter written, or is a chapter to be written for that book of the bombings?
Well, I'm sorry, I got diverted on the wrong, I was reading the wrong Bible. On the 9/11 issue, there also are some things that are going to happen. Most importantly, a year ago, the Congress passed a bill which is called JASTA. The families of the victims, and there were approximately 3,000 people killed on 9/11, 90% of whom were U.S. citizens. They have been going to court to seek relief, suing the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and other Saudi interests. They have been thrown out on numerous occasions of court based on a doctrine called sovereign immunity, which goes back into English law that the king can do no wrong, therefore you can't sue the king. The king is immune from suit. That principle has been applied now to civil governments, not just monarchies. But the Congress modified that standard to specifically allow suits under where a foreign government had been essentially a co-conspirator with a terrorist organization in an attack on U.S. soil in which U.S. citizens were either killed or injured. And that under that new standard, the families are proceeding again. The estimate is that the trial will be held sometime probably around the middle of 2018. And in advance of that, through depositions and other forms of evidence that will be gathered, I think a lot of information about 9/11 will come forth. And then at the trial itself, there will be even more material that will be publicly available.
You think the government was complicit?
Yes, I have no question that by any standard of complicity that 9/11 would not have occurred without the assistance of Saudi Arabia.
Well, let's express our appreciation.